Facing the U.S. soldiers and their semi-automatic M1 Garands in the Pacific Theater of Operations were Japanese soldiers carrying bolt-action Type 99 Arisaka rifles. After the war, thousands of Type 99s made their way to the U.S. as trophies of American soldiers. The other great Axis power, Germany, had also provided its soldiers with high-quality bolt-action rifles. The Carabiner 98K was the latest in a line of reliable rifles of the Mauser design, going back to the G98 of World War I. It was used by German soldiers on every front and throughout the war. The K98 was well regarded for its accuracy, at 500 meters without sights, or at 1,000 with a scope. But its rate of fire couldn't compare to the Garand. The Germans weren't the only ones who used the K98. The rifles were also popular among Germany's enemies. The Soviet forces, in particular, made great use of captured K98s in the early years of the war, when they lacked sufficient arms of their own. The standard rifle for the Soviet forces was the Mosin Nagant rifle model 1891-30. The Mosin Nagant rifles went back to the 1880s, when the Russian imperial government sought out a rifle design that could compete with the Mausers, the Lee Medfords, the Krag-Jurgensens, and other repeating bolt-action rifles. Captain Sergei Ivanovich Mosin of the Russian Army designed the rifle that would bear his name during the 1880s, and in 1891, his gun was selected for the Russian Imperial Forces, incorporating elements of the magazine design by the Belgian Leon Nagant. Modifications were made to the Mosin Nagant rifle over the years, and during World War II, the most common variant was the design from 1930. The model 91-30 maintained the sturdy and efficient bolt action and magazine from previous models. The barrel length was reduced 2 inches, giving the rifle an overall length of about 48.5 inches. An upper hand guard was added, and the rear sights were recalibrated. A mounted scope turned one variant of the 91-30 into the most widely manufactured sniper rifle in history. This was the sniper rifle used by Major Ludmila Pavlichenko, the most successful female sniper in history. Pavlichenko, already an accomplished marksman, volunteered for service when Germany invaded Russia in 1941. She was one of 2,000 Russian female snipers in World War II, and one of the only 500 who survived. She was credited with 309 confirmed kills, which included 36 enemy snipers. But the Mosin Nagant 91-30 remained a bolt-action rifle and suffered from the predictable slow rate of fire compared with the modern guns. After the German invasion, the Soviets began mass-producing a selective-fire, magazine-fed submachine gun, the PPSH-41. A simplified version of an earlier gun, the PPSH-41 was made almost entirely of stamped steel. This made it perfect for mass production, and by spring of 1942, factories in Moscow were stamping out 3,000 PPSH-41s a day. World War II had barely ended before the Cold War began. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other as the world's only 2 superpowers, and their ideological differences made military conflict seem inevitable. But in those early years, though the tension was palpable, the extent of the Soviet threat was not yet clear. What was clear was the enormous cost of maintaining a large, well-equipped, well-trained army. In 1945, defense spending was almost 90% of the total spending by the federal government, up from 18% in 1940. Budget cuts reduced the forces further, and by June 1947, the Army consisted of fewer than 700,000 ground troops and 300,000 airmen. Though this was still sizable for a peacetime army, the loss of personnel meant fewer equipment and maintenance specialists, and equipment deteriorated rapidly. Meanwhile, the country of Korea was coming out from under 40 years of control by Imperial Japan and was being split apart between communist forces in the north and nationalist forces in the south. The nation was split in half at the 38th parallel. In the south, the U.S. maintained a small number of military advisors. The Soviets dominated the northern half, which was filled with communist Korean soldiers who had just helped Mao Zedong's forces take control of China. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, with Soviet and Chinese approval, invaded South Korea. The U.S. convinced the UN Security Council to establish a United Nations Command, or UNC, to defend South Korea, under the leadership of the U.S. and General Douglas MacArthur. The U.S. would bring to the Korean conflict many of the same weapons that served them well in World War II. The M1918A2 BAR rifle, the M1 Garand, and variants like the M1C sniper rifle, the M1 carbine, and the M2 with a 30 cartridge magazine, the Thompson M1A1 and the M3A1 grease gun, the Ma Deuce heavy machine gun. The Soviet guns of World War II were also present in Korea, only this time in the hands of America's enemies. The Communist Chinese People's Volunteer Army and the North Korean People's Army were armed with licensed copies of the PPSH-41 submachine gun called the Chinese 50. They also had plenty of the original, as the Soviets provided large numbers of PPSH-41s to communist guerrilla forces. Less accurate than the M1 Garand, the PPSH-41 proved to be a powerful weapon in the close-range jungle combat that often occurred. Although the battleground was in Korea, the war was in reality part of a larger struggle between the U.S. and the communist threat posed by the Soviet Union and China. And even after the major conflict in Korea had ended, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued. In fact, at the time of the armistice that ended major fighting in the Korean War in July 1953, the U.S. had already been involved in another Southeast Asian country for 3 years. The small number of military advisors in Vietnam at that time would increase dramatically in the early 60s, as once again, the U.S. would fight a proxy war in Southeast Asia against forces supported by the Soviets and the People's Republic of China. And they would bring to that fight the latest and the greatest American gun, the M16.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.